A father breaks all the rules to sneak a golden retriever into a hospital, risking everything to fulfill his terminally ill daughter's final wish. But when security intervenes and her life hangs by a thread, an unexpected turn leaves everyone questioning, can love truly defy the impossible? The soft hum of medical machines filled the sterile air of Clara's hospital room. The faint scent of antiseptic lingered, blending with the earthy aroma of the single potted plant on her bedside table, a gift from her nurse. Clara, barely 10 years old, lay in her bed, her frail fingers clutching a worn photograph. In it, a golden retriever with kind, soulful eyes stood next to a much healthier, smiling Clara. Her whisper broke the silence. "I wish I could see him one more time." Victor, Clara's father, stood silently in the doorway, his face etched with exhaustion and grief. His work-worn hands clutched another photo, this one of his late wife, Clara's mother. She had always been the emotional anchor of their family. Now, with Clara's health deteriorating, he felt adrift. The distance between him and Clara wasn't just physical, it was emotional. But he knew her one request involved Max, the golden retriever who had been her constant companion since her mother's death. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room, each second a reminder of time slipping away. Victor shifted his weight, torn between the hospital's strict no animals policy and his daughter's desperate wish. Clara's health was failing faster than the doctors anticipated, and they had made it clear that granting her wish might be one of the last meaningful things they could do for her. Victor caught the eye of the nurse as she passed by. "Rules are rules," she said softly, almost to herself. Then, with a glance back at him, she added, "But sometimes, love makes people do extraordinary things." Her cryptic words lingered as Victor stared at the photograph in his hands. Could he break the rules for Clara's sake? Later that evening, the doctors called Victor into a private room. Their faces were solemn, their tone heavy. "Victor, we need to prepare for the worst," one of them said. "Clara's condition is worsening. If there's something she wants, now is the time to make it happen." Victor felt his chest tighten. He thought of Max, who had been staying with a neighbor since Clara's hospitalization. Max had been Clara's shadow, her protector, and her confidant. After her mother's sudden passing, it was Max who had nudged her awake when she cried herself to sleep and who brought her toys to cheer her up. Victor had never fully understood the depth of their bond until now, when it seemed like Max might be her only comfort. That night, Victor sat in the hospital's dimly lit waiting area, wrestling with his thoughts. He could almost hear his late wife's voice urging him to follow his heart. "Always choose love," she had said countless times. Clara's fragile words echoed in his mind, "I wish I could see him one more time." The next morning, Victor made a call. "Jim," he said to his neighbor, his voice shaking, "I need you to bring Max to me." There was a pause on the other end before Jim replied, "You sure about this? You know the rules." Victor's resolve hardened. "I'll take full responsibility." The plan to smuggle Max into the hospital wasn't without obstacles. Victor knew the security guards were vigilant, and the thought of being caught made his palms sweat. But the idea of seeing Clara's face light up for the first time in weeks gave him courage. He needed her to feel joy again, even if just for a moment. As Victor hung up the phone, he stared out the hospital window. The world outside seemed oblivious to his turmoil, the winter sun casting long shadows on the frosted ground. He didn't know what the consequences of his actions would be, but he knew this: for Clara, he would risk everything. The clock in Clara's room ticked on, each passing second tightening the loop of suspense. Would Victor succeed in bringing Max to her side? Would the rules bend in the face of a father's love and a dog's unwavering loyalty? As the evening wore on, Victor sat alone in his car outside Jim's house, waiting for Max to be brought out. The faint glow of the street lamp illuminated his hands, which trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. His mind was a storm of memories, each one pulling him deeper into the past. He remembered the first time Clara had begged for a dog. "I need a friend," she'd said, her big brown eyes brimming with unshed tears after another lonely day at school. Victor had hesitated at first, worried about the responsibility. But his wife, always the mediator, had nudged him gently. "She's asking for companionship, Victor. Let's give her that." When Max arrived, he had been an unruly ball of fur and energy, immediately making a mess of the house. Victor had grumbled about chewed-up shoes and fur-covered couches, but Clara's laughter had been worth every inconvenience. Max had grown to become more than a pet. He was Clara's anchor in a world that often felt too big for her. After her mother's death, he became her lifeline, pulling her through days when even Victor felt he had no strength left to give. A sudden knock on the car window startled Victor from his thoughts. Jim stood outside, Max's leash in hand. The dog wagged his tail eagerly, but there was a hesitation in his eyes, as though he sensed the gravity of the moment. "Here he is," Jim said softly, handing over the leash. "You're sure about this?" Victor nodded, but his resolve wavered as Max hopped into the car and immediately rested his head on Victor's lap. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," he muttered to himself. Max let out a soft whine, as if offering reassurance. For the first time in weeks, Victor allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. By the time Victor and Max reached the hospital, the building was bathed in the soft glow of night. The hallways were quiet, save for the occasional murmur of nurses or the distant beep of monitors. Victor glanced at Max, who padded silently beside him, his leash wrapped tightly in Victor's hand. "Just stay calm, buddy," he whispered. "We're doing this for her." Victor's heart pounded as he approached Clara's room. Each step felt heavier than the last, his fear of being caught clashing with his determination to see Clara happy. He paused outside her door, taking a deep breath. Peering inside, he saw her curled up under the blanket, the photograph still clutched in her hand. Pushing the door open quietly, Victor stepped inside with Max. The dog immediately perked up, his tail wagging furiously as he caught sight of Clara. For a moment, Victor worried she might be asleep, but then her eyes fluttered open. They widened in disbelief as her gaze locked onto Max. "Max," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Max bounded forward, his paws lightly pressing against the bed as he nudged her hand with his nose. Clara let out a small sob, her frail arms wrapping around his neck. "You're really here," she murmured, her tears soaking into his fur. Max stayed still, his gentle presence offering her a comfort words couldn't provide. Victor stood back, watching the reunion unfold. His throat tightened as he realized he hadn't seen Clara this animated in months. For once, her pale cheeks seemed to regain a hint of color, and her smile was no longer a memory but a vivid, heartwarming reality. "Thank you, Dad," Clara said, looking at him with a mix of gratitude and love. "You brought him back to me." Victor swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "You mean the world to me, Clara. I just want you to be happy." Max curled up at Clara's side, his head resting on her lap as she absent-mindedly stroked his fur. The sight was almost too much for Victor, the weight of his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. In that moment, he realized something profound: Max wasn't just Clara's lifeline. He was theirs. Victor's relief at seeing Clara smile was short-lived. As he stood by her bedside, his mind raced with the potential consequences of smuggling Max into the hospital. Every interaction with the staff felt like a test, every glance like an accusation. He knew the rules, and he had broken them. The next morning, as sunlight spilled through the blinds, the hospital administrator walked into Clara's room. Victor's heart leapt into his throat. The woman's sharp gaze lingered on Max, who lay peacefully at Clara's feet. "Mr. Bennett," she began, her tone clipped. "You're aware this is against hospital policy, correct?" Victor stepped forward, shielding Clara and Max with his body. "I know," he admitted, his voice steady despite his fear. "But Clara doesn't have much time, and this is all she wanted." The administrator's stern expression softened for a moment, but it returned just as quickly. "We have protocols for a reason," she replied. "If word gets out that we allowed this, it could jeopardize the hospital's credibility." Victor clenched his fists, torn between defending his actions and pleading for leniency. He opened his mouth to argue, but Clara's soft voice cut through the tension. "Please," she said, her gaze fixed on the administrator. "Max makes me feel better. He helps me breathe." The administrator hesitated, her eyes flicking between Clara and Max. "I'll need to discuss this with the board," she said finally, before walking out of the room. Victor let out a shaky breath, but the unease in his chest remained. He knew the battle was far from over. That evening, a storm rolled in, and the hospital seemed to reflect the chaos outside. Victor paced the small waiting area, his mind churning. Clara's vitals had shown slight improvement since Max's arrival, but the looming threat of his removal filled Victor with dread. As he passed the nurse's station, the mysterious nurse who had hinted at bending the rules appeared again. "You've stirred quite the debate, Mr. Bennett," she said, a small smile playing at her lips. Victor frowned. "They'll make me take him away, won't they?" The nurse tilted her head, as if weighing her words carefully. "Maybe. But sometimes people just need to be reminded what really matters." She slid a folded piece of paper across the desk to him. "This might help." Victor hesitated before unfolding it. Inside was a set of instructions, a side entrance with lax security, a time when shifts changed, and a note, "For emergencies only." He looked up to thank her, but she was already gone. Later that night, the administrator returned with 2 board members. Their conversation was brief but tense. "Mr. Bennett," one of them said firmly, "will need to move the dog out of the hospital by morning." Before Victor could respond, Clara's monitor began to beep erratically. Max, sensing her distress, leapt onto the bed and pressed his nose to her cheek. Almost immediately, her breathing evened out, and the beeping slowed. The room fell silent. The administrator looked stunned. One of the board members whispered, "That's not possible." Victor seized the moment. "This is what I've been trying to tell you," he said passionately. "Max isn't just her pet, he's her lifeline. You saw it with your own eyes." The administrator exchanged a glance with the others, uncertainty flickering across her face. "We'll reconvene in the morning," she said, her voice unsteady. As they left, Victor felt a surge of hope but knew he wasn't in the clear yet. In the early hours of the morning, a security guard appeared at the door, clearly uneasy. "Mr. Bennett," he said quietly, "I don't agree with the board, but orders are orders. I'm supposed to escort the dog out." Victor's stomach sank, but before he could respond, Max let out a soft bark. Clara stirred awake and whispered, "Don't let them take him, Dad." With time running out, Victor remembered the nurse's instructions. If the hospital wouldn't bend, he'd have to act. He nodded at Clara, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "I'll fix this." Victor's hands shook as he led Max through the hospital's quiet halls, following the nurse's instructions. He felt as though every sound, the soft scuff of his shoes, the jingle of Max's collar, echoed like a siren. The storm outside raged on, thunder rumbling ominously as rain streaked the windows. The dim lighting of the side corridor made every shadow feel like an obstacle. Max, sensing Victor's unease, remained calm and obedient, his golden fur gleaming faintly under the flickering overhead lights. "Good boy," Victor whispered, though his heart raced with the weight of what he was doing. He passed the nurse's station, where the mysterious nurse caught his eye and gave a subtle nod. Her quiet support strengthened his resolve. The plan seemed flawless, until it wasn't. As Victor approached the side exit, a voice called out behind him. "Mr. Bennett." It was the security guard, flanked by a hospital administrator. The guard looked apologetic, but the administrator's face was etched with authority. "You cannot remove the dog from this building without authorization," she said sharply. "And certainly not without informing us." Victor turned to face them, Max sitting calmly at his side. "I'm not removing him from the building," Victor said firmly. "I'm taking him back to my daughter." "That's against policy," she replied, her voice rising. "You're jeopardizing everyone here by defying hospital regulations." Victor's frustration boiled over. "And what about Clara?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Do your policies comfort her when she cries at night? Do they bring color to her cheeks or hope to her heart? Max does. He's the only thing keeping her going. If you take him away, you might as well take away her last chance." The confrontation drew the attention of a small crowd, nurses, doctors, even patients who peered curiously from their rooms. The nurse who had helped Victor stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Sometimes, healing isn't just about medicine," she said. "We've all seen the change in Clara since Max arrived. If this dog is helping her fight, then why are we standing in the way?" The administrator faltered, caught off guard by the growing support around her. Victor seized the moment. "Please," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Let them stay together. If you were in my shoes, wouldn't you do the same?" A tense silence filled the hallway as everyone waited for the administrator's response. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her decision. "For now, Max can stay," she said quietly. "But I'll need to report this to the board." Victor nodded, relief washing over him like a wave. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. He returned to Clara's room with Max at his side. Clara's face lit up the moment she saw him, her joy erasing the fear and tension of the past hours. "I knew you'd come back," she said softly, her hand reaching out for Max. Max leapt onto the bed with surprising gentleness, curling up beside Clara. She buried her face in his fur, her breathing steady and calm. For the first time in weeks, the lines of pain and exhaustion on her face seemed to fade. Victor sat in the chair by her bed, watching his daughter and her dog with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. He reached out and took Clara's hand in his, squeezing it gently. "We're here, sweetheart," he said. "We're not going anywhere." The mysterious nurse appeared once more, standing quietly at the door. She caught Victor's eye and smiled, as though to say, "You did the right thing." As the storm outside began to subside, the hospital seemed to exhale with it. Victor stayed by Clara's side, Max nestled close, and for the first time in what felt like forever, hope returned to their little family.